The night was cool, the kind where the streets looked glossy under the lamplight and traffic had thinned to a trickle. Tanya Robinson drove her modest gray sedan through the quiet American suburb, returning home from a long evening visiting her sister. She wasn't in her robe or her chambers now. She wasn't Judge Robinson, the woman who presided with a gavel in hand. She was simply Tanya, a black woman heading home, blending into the ordinary rhythm of night. Her radio hummed low. She kept her hands steady on the wheel, posture relaxed, mind drifting through thoughts of tomorrow's docket. That was when she noticed the patrol car trailing her. Its headlights flashed brighter than necessary, sitting too close to her bumper. She glanced in her rearview mirror, her dark eyes narrowing slightly. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't run a stop sign. She knew how she drove, cautious, deliberate, careful. And yet, the blue and white shadow lingered. The sudden pop behind her shattered the illusion of safety. She flinched. A loud crack echoed against the empty street, followed by a faint scrape of metal. Tanya's eyes widened. The patrol car had surged forward just enough to strike her rear tail light. Glass shattered, scattering red shards across the pavement. Her car jolted, though she kept control. "Unbelievable," Tanya muttered under her breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. She pulled over, her pulse quickening but her expression remaining calm. The squad car's lights flared blue and red, painting the empty street in a strobe of authority. Two officers stepped out. Officer Scott Miller, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying the swagger of unchecked arrogance, moved first. Beside him, Officer Kevin Turner followed, shorter but with the same smirk of someone who enjoyed the shield of the badge a little too much. "Evening," Miller drawled, tapping his flashlight against the cracked tail light like a trophy. "Looks like you've got a busted light back here." Tanya stepped out of her car carefully, standing tall. Her presence was calm, almost commanding, though she wore nothing but jeans and a sweater. "I didn't have a busted light until your cruiser rammed into me," she said evenly. Turner let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "That's not how we saw it. Light was already busted. You were driving defective equipment. That's a violation." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't let anger creep into her tone. "I heard the crack. You hit me." Miller took a step closer, flashlight beam circling her face. "Are you questioning an officer of the law?" His voice had that tone, mocking, laced with superiority. "I'm stating what happened." Tanya's voice didn't waver. "And I'd like your badge numbers." Turner snorted, muttering something under his breath that sounded like uppity. Miller ignored her request. Instead, he leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to sharpen its edge. "Lady, you don't want to make this harder on yourself. Broken taillight's one thing. Resisting? That's another story." Tanya stared back, unflinching. Years on the bench had taught her how to read liars, how to measure a man's arrogance, how to stand her ground without raising her voice. But here on the side of the road, she wasn't Judge Robinson in a black robe. She was a black woman facing two white officers who thought they could script their own version of events. "Turn around," Miller barked suddenly. "Hands on the car." "For what reason?" she asked, her voice level. "Suspicious behavior," Turner cut in, already stepping closer. "We'll search the vehicle." "You don't have probable cause," Tanya replied firmly. "And you know it." Miller's lips curled into a smirk. "Probable cause? Big words. You a lawyer or something?" Tanya's silence was deliberate. She wasn't about to reveal who she was. Not yet. Miller reached for her arm, gripping it tighter than necessary. "When I say hands on the car, you put hands on the car." The grip stung, but Tanya didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her head slowly toward him. "Let go," she said, each word deliberate, steady. He squeezed harder. "Or what?" Her eyes didn't leave his. "Or this will not end the way you think it will." Turner chuckled, clearly entertained by what he saw as defiance. "Scott, she thinks she's tough. Probably one of those activists. Wants to make a scene." They forced her against the car, cold metal pressing into her palms. She didn't resist, didn't raise her voice, but inside, her resolve hardened. She'd seen countless defendants in her courtroom tell stories just like this. stories often dismissed, brushed aside. Now it was her turn to live it. Miller leaned close to her ear, his words dripping with disdain. "Women like you need to learn respect." Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Silence was her shield now. After minutes of unnecessary intimidation, they scribbled a citation for driving with defective equipment and handed it to her with smug satisfaction. "Get it fixed," Turner said, tossing the paper onto her hood. "Or next time we won't be so generous." They strode back to their cruiser, laughing quietly between themselves, as if they'd just won some unspoken game. Tanya stood still, watching their taillights disappear into the distance. Her own light was shattered, but her composure remained intact. She picked up the citation, folded it neatly, and slid it into her pocket. Her expression was unreadable, but her thoughts were sharp and clear. They had no idea. They thought they'd humiliated a random woman on a quiet American street. They thought they'd broken her down with intimidation and arrogance. What they didn't know was that in just a few weeks, fate would turn the tables. The very men who broke her taillight would stand in a courtroom accused of misconduct, and the judge presiding over their case would be her. But that revelation was still to come. For now, Tanya drove home with one working taillight and a steady grip on the wheel, the weight of injustice sitting heavy on her shoulders. She knew the law, she knew procedure, and she knew that sooner or later the truth always found its way into the light. Tanya Robinson had always believed in order. Not just the kind imposed by the clang of a gavel, but the deeper kind, the order that came from structure, fairness, and the rule of law. It wasn't something she had the luxury of taking for granted. She was born into a world that often saw her as less before she ever spoke a word, and she had fought for every inch of respect she carried with her now. She grew up in Richmond, Virginia, the daughter of a postal worker and a schoolteacher. Her father, David Robinson, spent long hours walking his mail route, rain or shine, his shoes worn down but his back always straight. Her mother, Lorraine, was the kind of woman who could command a room full of restless children with nothing but her voice. Discipline and patience were stitched into Tanya's bones by the time she was old enough to understand that not everyone in America played by the same rules. At school, Tanya excelled. Teachers quickly noticed she had a memory that clung to detail like a vice and a voice that refused to be silenced when something wasn't right. By the time she reached high school, she was the one classmates came to when they felt a teacher had been unfair, the one who read the student handbook front to back and could recite it from memory. Her peers joked that she'd end up a lawyer one day. Tanya never laughed at the idea. She knew they were right. She earned a scholarship to Howard University, where her world widened. It was there she learned to sharpen her arguments, to dissect precedent, and to debate not just with passion, but with precision. Howard's law library became her second home, and her professors recognized her relentless drive. Some of her classmates dreamed of corporate law, big firms, big paychecks. Tanya dreamed of something different, the courtroom, the place where real lives were shaped by verdicts and sentencing. Her path wasn't easy. As a young black woman entering the legal field, she faced the raised eyebrows, the patronizing smirks, the whispered doubts about whether she was tough enough or experienced enough. She let those doubts fuel her instead of deter her. She clerked for judges who barely acknowledged her in the beginning, but by the end of each term they relied on her meticulous research and sharp instincts. When she finally ran for a local judgeship, the campaign was grueling. She was outspent by opponents and underestimated by skeptics. But she knocked on doors, she spoke in church basements, she listened in community centers. People saw in her what the establishment tried to ignore: fairness, resolve, and the ability to hold her ground. Against the odds, Tanya Robinson won. On the bench, she developed a reputation quickly. Defendants described her as stern but fair. Prosecutors respected her sharp questions, though they often left the courtroom rattled after facing them. Defense attorneys appreciated that she listened, truly listened, instead of brushing aside their arguments. She carried herself with the composure of someone who knew that every word she spoke could alter a life. That composure was what carried her through the night of the Taillight incident. She'd endured slights before, endured microaggressions whispered in the hallways of power, but standing on the side of that road, pinned against her car by men who wore uniforms of authority, had cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Not because she feared them, but because she recognized the pattern. She'd seen men like Miller and Turner before. She'd seen them on the stand, testifying with smug certainty. She'd seen their reports, polished lies crafted to justify force. And now she had lived it. When she arrived home that night, she didn't go straight to bed. She placed the citation neatly on her kitchen counter, poured herself a glass of water, and sat at the small table where she often reviewed case notes late into the night. Her house was modest. 2 bedrooms filled with books and framed photographs. On the mantel was a picture of her law school graduation, her parents beaming at her side. She stared at that citation for a long time. Broken taillight, defective equipment. Nothing in the words hinted at the shove against cold metal, at the grip on her arm, at the contempt in Miller's voice when he told her to learn respect. The paper was clean, clinical, the kind of record that could be waved in front of a jury while the truth remained buried. Tanya had made a career out of exposing half-truths and peeling away the layers of polished reports. She knew this would be no different. But this time, it was personal. The following week passed in a blur of hearings and motions. Tanya wore her robe each morning, entered her courtroom with the same steady stride, and presided over cases with her usual discipline. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, every gavel strike was heavier. Every officer who testified reminded her of Miller and Turner. Every defendant who claimed they'd been mistreated no longer sounded abstract. Then came the news. The case involving misconduct allegations against officers Scott Miller and Kevin Turner had landed on her docket. She read the case file slowly, carefully, the words settling into her like stones dropped into deep water. The charges were serious: falsified reports, excessive force, racial bias complaints that had been ignored until a community group pressured the district attorney's office to take action. And now, by what seemed like fate, the case would be tried in her courtroom. Tanya closed the file, her expression unreadable. She had a duty to remain impartial, to uphold the law. But she also carried something these men didn't know yet: knowledge of exactly who they were when the cameras weren't rolling, when the reports weren't being filed. She had felt their grip, heard their words, seen their arrogance up close. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very men who had broken her taillight and written her a false citation would walk into her courtroom expecting another chance to spin their story. What they didn't know was that the judge presiding over them was the same woman they'd humiliated on that quiet night. Still, Tanya didn't celebrate. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about satisfaction. It was about truth. She had seen too many cases crumble because emotion overshadowed evidence. If she was going to preside over this trial, she would do it by the book, steady, precise, unyielding. But she would also ensure that every lie was exposed, every half-truth peeled away until only the facts remained. As the trial date drew closer, whispers began spreading through the courthouse halls. Community members filled the benches during pre-trial motions. Reporters hovered in the lobby, sensing a story that stretched beyond routine misconduct. Tanya maintained her calm. On the surface, she was the same Judge Robinson, sharp, measured, disciplined. But beneath that surface, her resolve was steel. She wasn't just presiding over another case. She was watching the system itself being tested. And for the first time, she wasn't just the judge. She was also the witness who knew what these officers were capable of when they thought no one of power was watching. The morning of the trial broke clear and bright, the kind of day that made the courthouse steps gleam under the sun. Reporters clustered outside, their cameras snapping at every attorney, every witness, every spectator who walked up the wide stone stairs. A case involving police misconduct was always a spectacle, but this one carried a charge that buzzed through the city. Whispers of falsified reports, Racially motivated stops and abuses of power had spread like wildfire. Now everyone wanted to see whether the system would protect its own, or whether it would finally hold them accountable. Inside, the air was heavier. The courtroom hummed with low murmurs, 100 pairs of eyes darting between the prosecution's table and the defense. Officer Scott Miller sat upright, his jaw set, the corners of his mouth twitching in a forced smirk. Officer Kevin Turner, leaning slightly in his chair, tapped his fingers against the polished wood as though restless with confidence. They wore their uniforms like armor, polished badges glinting under the overhead lights. Tanya Robinson entered with the authority that came from years on the bench. She wore her black robe, her stride steady, her expression neutral. The bailiff called the room to order, and the murmurs died instantly. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. The Honorable Judge Tanya Robinson presiding. Everyone stood. Tanya took her seat at the bench, surveying the courtroom with calm, sharp eyes. She did not linger on the two men at the defense table, though she felt their presence like static in the air. She had seen them before, just not like this. "You may be seated," she said, her voice even. The room sat, the creak of benches echoing faintly. The prosecutor, Richard Coleman, rose first. His salt and pepper hair was cropped short, his tailored suit designed to project authority. "Your Honor, the state is prepared to proceed." Tanya gave a slight nod. "Very well. Opening statements." Coleman stepped toward the jury, his tone deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about trust. Trust that was broken when two officers, men sworn to protect and serve, chose instead to abuse their authority. You will hear testimony, you will see reports, and by the end of this trial you will see a clear pattern of misconduct that cannot be ignored." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "The badge is supposed to represent integrity, but when integrity is compromised, justice demands accountability." He returned to his seat, the jury's eyes following him with measured curiosity. The defense attorney, Thomas Blake, rose next. Younger than Coleman but equally sharp in appearance, Blake's confidence radiated in his stride. He adjusted his tie, glanced briefly at the jury, then began. "These men," he said, gesturing to Miller and Turner, "are decorated officers with years of service. They've put themselves in harm's way for this community more times than any of us can count. And now, because of baseless complaints and distorted perceptions, their character is being dragged through the mud." His voice rose slightly. "The prosecution will try to convince you that these officers acted with malice, with bias, with disregard for the people they swore to protect. But the evidence will show otherwise. The evidence will show that they followed protocol, that they acted in the best interest of public safety, and that they are now being scapegoated for doing their jobs." Blake returned to his seat, confidence brimming. Tanya's gaze moved to the jury, their faces composed but alert. She knew what was at stake, knew how these battles were fought. She folded her hands lightly, her expression unreadable. "Prosecution, call your first witness," she said. Coleman stood. "The state calls Officer Scott Miller." Miller rose, walking with exaggerated calm to the stand. He adjusted his uniform before sitting, his expression a calculated mask of confidence. The bailiff swore him in, and Miller leaned into the microphone. "Officer Miller," Coleman began, "please state your name and occupation for the record." "Scott Miller," he replied smoothly. "Patrol officer, City Police Department, 10 years of service." Coleman nodded. "Officer Miller, can you describe the events leading to the allegations against you?" Miller launched into his story, his voice firm, his tone rehearsed. "On the night in question, my partner and I observed a vehicle driving with a defective taillight. This is a clear traffic violation, and we initiated a stop. The driver appeared agitated, uncooperative. When we attempted to explain the violation, she became defensive, questioning our authority. We followed protocol. We issued a citation." Coleman tilted his head. "Did you or your partner use unnecessary force at any point during this interaction?" "Absolutely not," Miller said without hesitation. "The driver was confrontational. We remained professional." From the bench, Tanya's eyes remained steady, Her face gave nothing away, but inside, she registered every lie, every omission. He hadn't mentioned the impact of the cruiser, the grip on her arm, the contempt in his voice. He had cut the truth into a neat, sanitized version designed to fit a report. "Thank you, Officer Miller," Coleman said. "No further questions." Blake rose smoothly for cross-examination. "Officer Miller, in your decade of service, how many traffic stops would you say you've conducted?" "Hundreds," Miller replied confidently. "And in those stops, have you ever faced false accusations before?" "More times than I can count," Miller said with a faint smirk. "It comes with the job." Blake nodded, turning to the jury. "So these allegations, are they unusual?" "Not at all. People get upset when they're caught breaking the law. It's easier to blame the officer than to accept responsibility." Blake smiled faintly. No further questions. Miller stepped down, his stride firm as though he had just cemented his credibility. Turner was called next, echoing the same narrative. Calm, professional, by the book. The jury listened, some nodding slightly, others expressionless. Through it all, Tanya remained composed. She asked the necessary questions, kept order when murmurs rippled through the gallery, and maintained the image of impartial authority. But inside, her resolve only deepened. She had lived the truth of that night. She had felt their hands, heard their words, and now she would preside over the unraveling of their lies, one careful piece at a time. By the end of the first day, the officers sat at their table with faint smiles, convinced they had steered the narrative in their favor. Their defense attorney leaned back, satisfied with the performance. But Tanya knew better. Trials weren't won on opening days. They were won in the cracks of testimony, in the weight of evidence, in the moments when lies began to wobble under pressure, and she could already see the wobble. She banged her gavel, dismissing the court for the day. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9, she said. As the courtroom emptied, Miller and Turner exchanged a glance, their smirks tightening. Tanya rose from the bench, calm as ever. She knew what was coming, and she knew she would be ready. Because the truth, once buried, always had a way of clawing its way into the light. The second day of the trial began under a gray sky. Rain threatened but hadn't yet broken, and the courthouse loomed as if it absorbed the tension of the storm. By now, the case had captured not just local headlines but statewide attention. Crowds gathered outside, reporters calling questions that went unanswered. Inside, the benches were filled again, community members, activists, journalists, and curious onlookers. Everyone sensed that this wasn't going to be a routine trial. When Tanya Robinson entered, the room fell into silence. She carried her robe like armor, her expression controlled, her posture unshakable. She gavelled the court into session. "Prosecution, continue with your case." Richard Coleman stood, gathering his notes with the ease of experience. "Your Honor, the state calls Marcus Dean." A young man in his 20s stepped nervously to the stand. He wore a collared shirt, his hands fidgeting as the bailiff swore him in. Tanya's eyes softened slightly, though her face remained professional. She knew this moment was important, not just for the case, but for him. "Mr. Dean," Coleman began, "were you present on the night in question when Officers Miller and Turner stopped a vehicle?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir. I was walking home from work. I saw their cruiser pull behind the car." Coleman gestured. "And what did you observe?" Marcus licked his lips, speaking carefully. "I was across the street, but I saw the police car bump into the back of the lady's car. I heard the crack. That's when her taillight broke." A ripple of murmurs swept the courtroom. Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Coleman's tone was steady. "To be clear, you're saying the taillight was not broken before the patrol car made contact?" "That's right," Marcus said firmly now. "I saw it happen. It was fine before they pulled up. Then it shattered." Coleman nodded. "And did you observe the officer's interaction with the driver?" "Yes. They got out, and the taller one grabbed her arm. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't moving wild. She just stood there. He shoved her against the car." Blake shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. This witness can't know what was said between them." Tanya banged her gavel lightly. "Sustained in part. Jury will disregard interpretation of intent." Witness, stick to what you directly observed. Marcus nodded quickly. All I know is she wasn't fighting. They pushed her against the car anyway. Coleman gave a small nod. No further questions. Blake strode forward, his expression sharp. Mr. Dean, you said you were across the street, correct? Yes. And this was at night? Yeah. Street lights dim in that area, aren't they? Marcus hesitated. Some of them. So you were across a dark street at night, at a distance, Blake pressed. Isn't it possible you misheard or misinterpreted what you saw? Marcus straightened. No, sir, I know what I saw. The car hit her taillight. I heard it. Blake narrowed his eyes. And you didn't step forward to intervene? Didn't shout? Didn't call anyone? I didn't want to get in trouble, Marcus admitted, his voice lower. But I recorded part of it. The courtroom exploded in murmurs. Blake froze, his question hanging in the air like smoke. Coleman's head snapped up, sharp as a whip. You have a recording? Marcus nodded nervously. Yes, sir. On my phone. It's not the whole thing, but I caught some of it. The gallery erupted louder this time. Tanya banged her gavel hard. Order. This court will have order. Her tone cut the noise down, though the tension lingered like thunder waiting to break. Coleman approached the bench. Your Honor, the state moves to admit this recording into evidence. Blake objected, his words rushed. We have not authenticated this video. The defense was given no notice. Tanya's eyes locked on Blake. Authentication can be established through testimony. The objection is overruled. Proceed. Coleman retrieved the phone, which had been submitted for examination. The bailiff connected it to the court system, and the screen flickered to life. The footage was shaky, grainy, the angle partially blocked by Marcus's nervous hands. But the audio was clear. A man's voice barked, "Hands on the car!" A woman's voice, calm, firm. I haven't done anything wrong. The sound of a shove. Then Miller's unmistakable words. Women like you need to learn respect. The courtroom gasped, the words echoing like a gunshot. Miller's jaw tightened, color rising in his face. Turner looked down at the table, suddenly fascinated with his hands. Blake leapt up. Your Honor, context. Sit down, counselor, Tanya said sharply. The jury will consider what they heard. Coleman stepped back, letting the weight of the recording hang in the air. No further questions. Blake's cross-examination was limp, his attempt to poke holes in Marcus's recording falling flat. The damage was done. When Marcus stepped down, the gallery's energy was electric. People leaned forward, whispering to each other. The cracks in the officers' stories were widening. Miller's smugness was gone now, replaced by a stony glare fixed straight ahead. Turner shifted in his seat like a man who suddenly found the bench too hard. Tanya observed it all with calm precision. She had known the truth would surface, but seeing it play out was different. She remained impartial in tone, but her eyes were sharper now, her focus cutting through every detail. The afternoon session brought more witnesses, neighbors who had heard the confrontation, a mechanic who confirmed the taillight had been intact earlier that day. Each piece chipped at the officer's narrative. By the time court recessed, the mood was shifting. The defense still held its ground, but the confidence had dulled. Blake whispered urgently to his clients as they huddled at their table. Miller nodded stiffly. Turner shook his head. Tanya gavelled the session closed. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 o'clock sharp. As the room emptied, she remained at the bench a moment longer, watching the officers' shoulders tighten under the weight of unraveling lies. They had no idea who sat in judgment over them, not yet, but soon they would, and when that moment came, no smirk, no badge, no polished lie would protect them. The third day of testimony began with an edge sharper than before. The crowd outside the courthouse had doubled overnight. Reporters jostled for position on the steps, microphones thrust forward as attorneys pushed through, and local residents held hand-painted signs calling for accountability. The tension wasn't just in the courtroom anymore, it had spilled into the streets. Inside, the jury filed in with more weight on their shoulders than when they first sat down. They had seen the video, they had heard Marcus Dean's words, and they had begun to look at officers Scott Miller and Kevin Turner not as paragons of law enforcement, but as men capable of bending the truth. Tanya Robinson entered, her robe trailing behind her like a shadow. She called the room to order, her voice steady, her expression neutral. But her eyes, sharp, unyielding, swept over the defense table. Miller avoided her gaze. Turner looked pale. "Counsel," Tanya said, "you may proceed." Richard Coleman rose, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, the state rests its case." The declaration echoed across the room. It was now the defense's turn. Thomas Blake stood, his jaw tight but his demeanor polished. The defense calls Officer Scott Miller. Miller returned to the stand, shoulders squared, jaw clenched. He adjusted the microphone, his uniform crisp but his voice less steady than before. "Officer Miller," Blake began with a smile meant to project reassurance, "the prosecution has presented testimony and video evidence. Do you stand by your report?" "Yes," Miller said firmly, though his eyes betrayed strain. "The video didn't capture the full encounter. The driver was confrontational. She refused to cooperate. I had to take control." Blake nodded. "Did you ever intend to cause harm?" "Absolutely not." "And the phrase attributed to you, 'Women like you need to learn respect,' did you say it?" Miller hesitated, then forced a smirk. "Not in the way it was portrayed. My words were taken out of context." The jury shifted in their seats. His denial sounded rehearsed, brittle. Coleman rose for cross-examination. He approached slowly, each step deliberate. "Officer Miller, you testified that the video was incomplete. Do you deny that the voice heard on that recording was yours?" Miller's jaw tightened. "It was my voice, but—" "No buts," Coleman cut in sharply. "You admit you said those words." Miller's eyes darted toward the jury. "I was frustrated. She wasn't cooperating." Coleman's voice lowered, calm but edged with steel. "So, in frustration, you told a woman she needed to learn respect. Tell me, officer, is that part of your training? Is that departmental protocol?" Miller opened his mouth, then closed it again. "No," he muttered finally. Coleman pressed. "You also testified that the taillight was defective before you stopped the car. Multiple witnesses have testified otherwise. A mechanic confirmed it was intact earlier that day. Are you saying all of them are lying?" "I'm saying they're mistaken," Miller shot back, his voice rising. Coleman's gaze sharpened. "Or are you saying that the truth doesn't matter as long as your word is taken as gospel?" "Objection," Blake barked. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Tanya said, her gavel striking once. "Counsel, rephrase." Coleman's voice softened, but the weight remained. "Officer Miller, you swore an oath to uphold the law. Do you believe that includes telling the truth under oath?" "Yes." "Then let's hope you've remembered that today." Coleman stepped back. No further questions. Miller left the stand, his confidence drained, his gait stiff. Turner was called next. He echoed Miller's account, though his words trembled around the edges. Coleman dismantled him in cross-examination as well, exposing contradictions in their stories. By mid-afternoon, the defense looked battered. Blake paced at his table, flipping through his notes, his tie loosened. Miller sat rigid, his face pale with suppressed anger. Turner fidgeted constantly, his hands never still. The jury's eyes told the story, trust slipping, doubt spreading like cracks in glass. Yet through it all, Tanya remained composed. Her gavel kept order. Her voice held steady. Her eyes, though unreadable to most, carried the weight of memory. She remembered the sting of Miller's grip, the shove against her car, the smirk that told her she was less than him. And now, here they sat, reduced to fragments of credibility in her courtroom. During a short recess, Blake cornered his clients in the defense room. His voice, though muffled by the walls, carried frustration. "You two need to get it together. The jury doesn't buy the story. If either of you slip again, this case is over." Miller's reply was sharp, bitter. "We didn't do anything wrong," Turner muttered. "They're twisting it." Blake's response was tight. "No, you did this, and now I'm cleaning up the mess." When court reconvened, the defense attempted to regain footing. Blake called a fellow officer to testify on Miller and Turner's character, but under Coleman's cross-examination, the officer admitted he hadn't been present that night and knew only what they had told him. The testimony landed flat. The day ended with the defense rattled, their strategy crumbling. As the gallery emptied, Tanya sat at the bench a moment longer. She watched Miller and Turner file out, their shoulders hunched, their smirks long gone. She let the silence stretch before finally rising. Back in her chambers, she removed her robe and sat at her desk, the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders. She was Judge Robinson in the courtroom, impartial and composed. But in the quiet of her office, Tanya was the woman who had stood on the side of the road, taillight shattered, dignity tested. She closed her eyes, inhaling slowly. The truth was pushing its way to the surface, but soon, very soon, the whole courtroom would know that this wasn't just another case. The men on trial had no idea that the judge presiding over them was the very woman they had tried to intimidate. And when that revelation came, it would shake the walls of the courtroom to its foundation. By the fourth day, the courtroom had become a crucible. The air inside was thicker, the benches even more crowded. Spectators leaned forward, eager for every word. The journalists' pens scratched constantly, their cameras flashing as lawyers shuffled their papers. The atmosphere buzzed like a storm that refused to break. Tanya Robinson entered at precisely 9 o'clock, her robe flowing, her face calm. She gavelled the court to order, her voice slicing through the noise. "This court is now in session. Defense, you may proceed." Thomas Blake stood. He looked different now, less polished, less certain. His tie was tightened, his posture rigid, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. His clients had dragged him into a storm of their own making, and he was struggling to hold the line. "Your Honor," Blake began, "the defense would like to call Officer Kevin Turner back to the stand." Turner approached, his uniform freshly pressed but his shoulders tense. He avoided looking at the gallery, where whispers still lingered about the video and Marcus Dean's testimony. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and tried to project confidence. "Officer Turner," Blake said, his voice measured, "you've served this community for nearly 8 years. Would you describe your record?" Turner nodded quickly. "Yes, I've never had a serious disciplinary action. I've made hundreds of arrests, worked night shifts, responded to emergencies. I've done my job." "And on the night in question?" Turner swallowed. "We followed protocol. The driver was confrontational. She refused to cooperate. We issued a citation. That was it." Blake nodded, then turned to the jury. "So these allegations of excessive force, of misconduct, are they consistent with your service record?" "Absolutely not," Turner said, his voice growing firmer. "I take my job seriously. I respect the community I serve." Blake smiled faintly. No further questions. Richard Coleman rose slowly, his expression sharp. He walked toward Turner with deliberate steps. "Officer Turner, you testified that you respect the community. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Do you recall a conversation you had with Officer Miller during the stop?" Turner shifted. "What conversation?" Coleman's tone hardened. "The one captured on video, the one where you laughed and called the driver uppity." The courtroom gasped. Turner's face drained of color. "That," Turner stammered, "that was taken out of context." Coleman leaned in slightly. "What context, Officer Turner? What context justifies mocking a driver, calling her uppity while she was calm and asking for clarification?" Turner's eyes darted toward Miller, then back to the jury. "It was a joke." Poor choice of words. "A joke?" Coleman's voice rose sharp. "On duty? During a stop that ended with a woman shoved against a car? Is that your idea of professionalism?" Blake shot up. "Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness." "Overruled," Tanya said calmly, her gavel striking once. Her eyes fixed on Turner, though her expression remained neutral. Coleman pressed on. "Officer Turner, you say you respect the community, but in that moment, you demeaned a citizen. Isn't it true that your actions that night were not about law enforcement, but about control?" Turner's mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence was louder than any answer. "No further questions," Coleman said, stepping back. The jury watched Turner return to his seat, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. Miller avoided his gaze, staring straight ahead. The defense's strategy was crumbling. Each witness, each answer, each denial only deepened the cracks. By mid-morning, Blake requested a brief recess. Tanya granted it, her voice steady. 15 minutes. In the defense room, the atmosphere was tense. Blake slammed his folder shut. Do you understand what you've done? That recording? Your words? Do you realize how this looks? Turner's voice was tight. It was a slip. People talk. It doesn't mean... It means the jury doesn't trust you, Blake snapped. And once trust is gone, it doesn't come back. Miller leaned forward, his jaw clenched. We can still beat this. It's their word against ours. We wear the badge. That means something. Blake stared at him, disbelief flickering in his eyes. Not anymore. Not after that tape. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution pressed further. They introduced departmental records, complaints filed against both officers over the years. Some were dismissed, others buried in bureaucracy, but the pattern was there. The jury studied the papers intently, the weight of repeated misconduct sinking in. Miller's face grew darker. Turner fidgeted, his hands trembling slightly. Through it all, Tanya remained calm, her gavel keeping order when murmurs grew too loud. But inside, her thoughts churned. Every detail reminded her of that night, the arrogance, the dismissal, the grip on her arm. She could still feel the cold metal of her car against her palms. But she also knew she had to remain steady. She was the judge. Her role was to preside, not to reveal. Not yet. As the afternoon session drew to a close, Coleman requested to submit additional evidence. Blake objected, citing late notice. The tension rose, both attorneys speaking over each other until Tanya's gavel cracked down. Enough, she said firmly. Her voice carried the weight of authority that silenced the room. This court will review the evidence tomorrow morning. Until then, we are adjourned. The crowd buzzed as the gavel echoed. The gallery spilled into the hallway, reporters sprinting to phone in updates, activists chanting on the courthouse steps. Inside, Miller and Turner gathered their papers with tight, angry movements. Their smirks were long gone. Tanya remained at the bench, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. But as the courtroom emptied, she allowed herself a single thought. The walls were closing in, and soon the truth would no longer be something she carried silently. It would become the very heart of the trial. The fifth day of trial dawned with a restless energy. The courthouse lawn was thick with people, protesters chanting for justice, countergroups waving flags, and reporters broadcasting live from the steps. Police officers stood in clusters, their presence both symbolic and practical, aware that the case inside was sending ripples far beyond the courtroom walls. Inside, the air was taut, almost brittle. The gallery was filled to capacity, benches crammed with citizens who understood that something monumental was unfolding. The jurors entered with quiet determination, their faces drawn tight, each of them carrying the burden of what they'd seen and heard. When Tanya Robinson entered, the room snapped to order. She gavelled the session into motion. Her voice was calm, but her eyes scanned the room with razor focus. She felt the weight of the moment, but her posture never revealed it. Prosecution, Tanya said evenly. You may proceed. Richard Coleman rose, his expression grim, his papers neatly stacked. Your Honor, the state has obtained additional evidence. This evidence directly addresses the credibility of the defendant's reports. Blake shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. We were not given notice. Tanya cut him off, her voice sharp. Counselor, you will have your chance to review. Sit down. Blake's jaw tightened, but he obeyed. Coleman gestured to the bailiff, who wheeled in a small monitor. The gallery leaned forward, breath held as Coleman explained. This footage comes from a security camera mounted outside a business located across the street from where the stop occurred. The owner only recently came forward after seeing news coverage of this case. The video has been authenticated. Miller's head snapped toward Turner, his face paling. Turner shook his head quickly, mouthing something that looked like, "They can't." Tanya leaned back slightly, her face unreadable. Proceed. The screen flickered to life. The black and white footage showed a quiet street at night. Tanya's gray sedan came into view, pulling calmly to the curb. A patrol car followed, drawing too close. Then the bump. A clear, undeniable impact. Glass scattered across the pavement. The gallery erupted in gasps. The video continued. Miller and Turner exited their cruiser, approaching Tanya's car. Though the footage had no audio, their aggressive postures told the story. Miller's hand clamped on Tanya's arm. Turner stood with arms crossed, smirking. Tanya's body remained calm, steady, until Miller shoved her against the vehicle. The courtroom was electric. Whispers tore through the gallery. The jury leaned forward in disbelief, and the press scribbled furiously. "Order!" Tanya's gavel cracked, restoring silence. Her voice was steady, but inside her pulse hammered. She was watching her own humiliation replayed in public, a humiliation she had carried quietly until now. Coleman's voice was sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is the truth. Not the sanitized report submitted by these officers, not the rehearsed testimony you heard. This is the unvarnished reality of their actions." Blake leapt up, his voice straining. "Your Honor, this is prejudicial." Tanya's eyes cut to him. "It is probative. Overruled." The jury's eyes were locked on the defendants now. Miller's face was taut, beads of sweat forming at his temple. Turner slumped in his chair, his hands twitching against the table. Coleman pressed forward. "Your Honor, the state also calls Detective Samuel Price." A middle-aged detective in plain clothes stepped forward. He was sworn in, his posture steady, his tone direct. Price pulled out a folder. "Over the last 5 years, both officers have been named in multiple complaints involving excessive force and questionable stops. Most were dismissed internally, citing lack of evidence. But when reviewed collectively, a clear pattern emerges." He held up the papers. "The language is consistent. Claims of being shoved without cause, accused of resisting when calm, citations issued after minor or fabricated infractions, and in nearly every case, the complainant was a person of color." Gasps rippled again. Coleman nodded. "And did either officer face discipline for these repeated allegations?" "No," Price said bluntly. "Every complaint was either dismissed or ignored." The weight of his words fell like an anvil. The jury scribbled notes. The gallery buzzed with outrage. Blake's cross-examination was limp, his attempts to frame the complaints as unsubstantiated grievances, falling flat against the sheer number of them. Price remained firm, unshaken. By mid-afternoon, the defense was bleeding credibility. Blake requested yet another recess, his voice tight with strain. Tanya granted it, her tone brisk, her eyes unwavering. In the defense conference room, Miller slammed his fist on the table. "This is a witch hunt. They're dragging up garbage that never stuck." Turner's voice cracked. "That video, they've got us. We're done." Blake glared at them both. "Do you even understand what position you've put me in? The jury doesn't believe you. The evidence is stacked. And now," he stopped, exhaling hard. "Now I'm starting to wonder if you ever told me the full story." Miller leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "We can still fight this. They don't know who she island. They don't know what, really." Turner cut him off, panic flashing across his face. "What if she remembers? What if—" "Shut up," Miller snapped. When court reconvened, the tension was suffocating. Blake struggled to regain composure. But the jury's eyes told the story. They no longer saw Miller and Turner as credible officers. They saw them as men cornered by their own arrogance. Through it all, Tanya sat steady at the bench, her face calm but her heart pounding. The truth was creeping closer, piece by piece. She had not revealed her connection, but the evidence itself was pointing straight at her. The jury didn't know, the attorneys didn't know. But soon, the wall between Judge Robinson and the woman on that street would collapse. And when it did, the entire courtroom would stand in stunned silence. By the 6th day of the trial, the courthouse had transformed into a stage. The crowd outside was louder than ever, their chants rising into the morning air, echoing through the courthouse's stone facade. Inside, the tension pressed down like a storm cloud. The jury filed in, their eyes sharper, their notepads fuller. They had seen too much to shrug this off as another routine misconduct case. They had watched videos, heard testimony, read reports, and each piece had chipped away at the polished armor Miller and Turner once wore. When Tanya Robinson entered, the entire room rose. She gavelled the court to order with her usual composure, but the eyes on her felt heavier. Even the attorneys stole glances at her, sensing something about her presence that seemed different now. "Defense," Tanya said, her tone steady. "You may proceed." Thomas Blake rose, his jaw tight. He straightened his tie, but his face carried exhaustion. He had tried to control the narrative, but it was slipping faster than he could grasp. Still, he wasn't finished. Desperation had its own kind of energy. "Your Honor," Blake began. "The defense calls Officer Scott Miller back to the stand." Miller rose stiffly, his uniform impeccable, but his face drawn. He carried himself with a forced confidence, as though posture alone could rebuild credibility. He sat, adjusted the microphone, and waited. Blake's voice was deliberate. "Officer Miller, you've heard the evidence. You've seen the video. Do you still maintain that your actions were justified?" "Yes," Miller said quickly, almost too quickly. "The video shows part of the story, not all of it. The driver was confrontational. I had to take control of the situation." Blake nodded, encouraging him. "And the accusations that you fabricated details in your report?" Miller's jaw tightened. "They're false. I documented what happened to the best of my ability." "Did you ever target the driver because of her race?" "No," Miller snapped. "That accusation is insulting. I don't see color when I do my job." The jury shifted uncomfortably. His words rang hollow, rehearsed, out of place in the face of evidence they had already seen. Coleman rose slowly, his expression sharp. He approached the stand, each step deliberate. "Officer Miller, you've testified that the driver was confrontational. Tell me, what exactly did she say that made you feel threatened?" Miller hesitated. "She questioned me." Coleman's voice cut through the silence. "She questioned you. That's it?" "She refused to comply," Miller added, his voice rising. Coleman leaned in slightly. "So a citizen asking why she's being stopped is, in your mind, confrontation worthy of force?" Miller's mouth opened, then closed. "I did what I thought was necessary." Coleman's tone sharpened. "And when you shoved her against the car, was that necessary too?" Miller's face flushed. "She wasn't cooperating." Coleman's voice dropped lower, colder. "Or was it about teaching her a lesson? You told her, and I quote, 'Women like you need to learn respect.' What exactly did you mean by women like you?" The jury leaned forward. The gallery buzzed. Miller froze, his face stiff. "I meant disrespectful," he stammered finally. "Disrespectful," Coleman repeated. "Not her race, not her gender, just disrespectful?" "Yes," Miller said quickly. Coleman straightened, his voice clear. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you heard it." His own words. He cannot explain them away. He stepped back. No further questions. Miller stepped down, his stride less confident than before. He returned to his seat, his shoulders tense, his jaw clenched. The afternoon session brought more blows. Coleman introduced audio records from dispatch logs, revealing that the officers had failed to report the alleged defiance until after the citation was written, a detail that suggested after-the-fact justification. Blake objected furiously, but Tanya overruled him. The jury listened, their pens scratching as the weight of inconsistencies grew heavier. By late afternoon, the defense's cracks had widened into fissures. Miller sat stone-faced, Turner jittered with nervous energy, and Blake's voice carried strain every time he rose. But then Blake tried a new tactic. He stood, cleared his throat, and addressed the bench. "Your Honor, in light of the accusations, I believe the court should know more about the complainant herself, the driver, her background, her record, her credibility." The gallery gasped. The jury's eyes widened. Even Coleman froze for a moment. Tanya's gavel struck hard. "Counselor, you are out of line. This court is not here to put the victim on trial." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Blake said quickly, his voice gaining an edge. "Credibility is central to this case. The jury deserves to know who she islanded." The room buzzed louder now. Reporters scribbled frantically. The defense had taken a gamble. Tanya's eyes fixed on Blake, sharp as steel. "You will tread carefully, Counselor." Blake pressed, his desperation showing. "This entire case hinges on her testimony, her behavior that night. We don't even know her name." The gallery erupted. The jurors whispered fiercely among themselves. Coleman leapt up. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an outrageous tactic." "Enough." Tanya's gavel cracked like thunder. Silence fell instantly. Her voice was calm but carried iron. "The victim's identity is not for this defense to weaponize. The evidence speaks for itself." Blake's eyes narrowed. He hesitated, then spoke softly, but with precision. "Then tell us, Your Honor. Who was she?" The room froze. Every head turned toward the bench. The gallery leaned forward. The jury stared, breath held. Tanya's face remained unreadable, but inside her pulse thundered. She felt the weight of the question pressing down like a stone. She had carried the truth quietly, but now the defense was dragging it into the open. She drew a slow breath, her hands steady on the bench. "That question is not relevant to these proceedings," she said evenly. But the seed had been planted. The gallery buzzed again. The jurors exchanged sharp looks. The possibility hung in the air like smoke. Coleman's voice cut in, sharp as a blade. "Your Honor, the defense is attempting to derail this trial with theatrics." "Overruled," Tanya said quickly. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were storm-dark. "This trial will proceed based on the facts." Blake sat down, but a faint, knowing smile tugged at his lips. He hadn't revealed anything concrete, but he had cracked the surface. For the rest of the afternoon, the courtroom moved in a haze. Testimony continued. Papers were passed, objections rose and fell, but the energy had shifted. The question lingered in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. Who was the woman in that video? Tanya gavelled the court into adjournment, her voice steady. "We reconvene tomorrow morning at 9. As the gallery spilled into the hallway, the reporters' questions grew sharper, louder. Inside her chambers, Tanya removed her robe and sat at her desk, her breath finally leaving her in a slow exhale. The time for silence was ending. The truth she had carried privately was clawing its way into the light, and she knew that tomorrow everything would change. The 7th day of the trial began under a low, brooding sky. Thunderclouds gathered over the city, the kind that promised a storm but held it back just long enough to thicken the air with unease. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was louder, more restless, their chants rising like a drumbeat. Inside, the benches filled quickly, journalists cramming every available space, cameras flashing as lawyers shuffled their files. Everyone knew the trial was building to something. When Tanya Robinson entered, The room rose in unison. She gavelled the court to order, her expression calm, her posture as steady as it had been from day one. Yet her eyes carried a sharper glint now, as though she knew the storm wasn't outside, it was about to break inside these walls. "Defense," Tanya said firmly. "You may proceed." Thomas Blake rose, his suit immaculate but his face drawn with fatigue. He knew his case was crumbling. The jury no longer trusted Miller and Turner, and the evidence had turned against them. But Blake wasn't finished. Desperation had carved something new in him, an edge sharpened by survival. "Your Honor," Blake began, "yesterday we touched on a critical question, the identity of the alleged victim. The jury deserves to know who she islanded, her credibility, her background, her motives." Coleman shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an outrageous attempt to intimidate." "Sit down, Mr. Coleman," Tanya said, her voice even but clipped. She turned to Blake. "Counselor, you are walking a fine line." Blake's voice rose. "With respect, Your Honor, we cannot fully evaluate this case if the central figure remains hidden. Who is she? Why has her identity been shielded? What is being kept from this jury?" The gallery erupted in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked. The jurors leaned forward, their faces tight with curiosity. Tanya's gavel cracked. "Order!" The room fell silent, but the tension was suffocating. Her eyes locked on Blake. "This trial is not about speculation. It is about facts and evidence." Blake pressed, his voice steady but daring. "Then give us the fact, Your Honor. Who was the woman shoved against that car? Who stood there while my clients allegedly abused their power?" The jury deserves an answer. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel strike. All eyes turned to Tanya. Miller and Turner froze, their faces pale. The jurors held their breath. Tanya sat motionless, her hands folded on the bench. She had carried this truth quietly, believing she could separate the woman on that street from the judge presiding here. But the line had blurred. The defense had forced her hand. She drew in a slow breath, her voice calm but resonant. "The woman in that video was me." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, shouts, reporters leaping to their feet, pens scratching wildly. The gallery surged with noise, a tidal wave of disbelief and shock. "Order!" Tanya's gavel cracked again and again, her voice rising above the chaos. "This courtroom will have order." The jury stared at her, stunned into silence. Coleman's mouth fell open, then shut, then opened again. Even he had not known. Blake stood frozen, his gamble having struck deeper than he anticipated. Miller's face drained of color. Turner slumped back in his chair, his lips trembling. They had walked into this trial thinking they could manipulate, intimidate, and fabricate. They had not realized their victim sat in judgment over them. When the noise finally subsided, Tanya's voice was clear, steady, unshakable. "Yes, I was the driver stopped by these officers. I was the one shoved against the car. I was the one told that I needed to learn respect, and yet I have sat here impartially, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Because this trial is not about me, it is about justice." The room was frozen. The jurors stared at her, their pens forgotten, their faces pale with shock. Blake found his voice, though it cracked. "Your Honor, this is a conflict of interest. You cannot preside over a case in which you are the complainant." Coleman sprang forward. "The evidence speaks for itself. The jury has seen it, heard it. The identity of the victim only underscores the truth." The gallery buzzed again. Tanya struck her gavel hard. "Order! Enough!" She leaned forward, her voice sharp, controlled. The defense is correct. This court acknowledges the conflict. These proceedings cannot continue under my jurisdiction. The case will be reassigned. Gasps rippled again. The trial had detonated in real time. But Tanya wasn't finished. She straightened, her eyes cutting through the defendants like steel. Before I step down, let me make one thing perfectly clear. This court has watched you lie. This court has seen your arrogance unravel. And this court has seen the truth. Her words fell like hammer blows. Miller shifted, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. Turner's head hung low, his shoulders shaking. Tanya turned to the jury, her voice steady. You have heard the evidence. You have seen the reality. Whatever judge presides over this case from this point forward, the truth remains unchanged. No badge, no uniform, no lie can erase it. She banged her gavel one final time. This court is adjourned. The room erupted again, louder than ever. Reporters swarmed the aisles. The gallery shouted. The jury sat stunned. Miller and Turner slumped at the defense table, the weight of exposure pressing them into their chairs. In her chambers, Tanya removed her robe slowly, folding it neatly. For the first time since the trial began, she allowed herself a deep exhale. The truth was out. The silence she had carried had broken. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, calm, composed, unflinching. She had faced them once on the side of a road, and again here in her courtroom. And in both places, she had stood tall. The trial would continue under another judge. The evidence would still speak. The jury would still render its verdict. But Tanya Robinson had already done what mattered most. She had made the truth impossible to bury. The courtroom did not settle for hours after Tanya Robinson's revelation. Reporters swarmed the hallways, cameras flashing as they tried to capture every lawyer, every juror, every witness. The news had already spread far beyond the courthouse walls. The judge presiding over the trial was the very woman the defendants had humiliated. The next morning, the courthouse was surrounded. Protesters shouted for accountability, some demanding justice for Tanya, others calling for a broader reckoning. Counter voices accused the trial of being a witch hunt. Police cordoned off the steps, trying to manage the crowd. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. A new judge had been assigned, Judge William Grant, an older white man with a reputation for fairness but little patience for theatrics. He entered briskly, bringing the courtroom to order. "All rise," the bailiff called. The room stood. Judge Grant took his seat, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom. "This case will proceed. I am fully briefed. We will resume with closing arguments." The jury leaned forward. The gallery held its breath. The trial was reaching its end. Richard Coleman stood first. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have seen the videos. You have heard the testimony. You have read the reports. And you know the truth. Officers Miller and Turner abused their power. They falsified their accounts. They mocked, demeaned, and physically mistreated a citizen who did nothing wrong. That citizen happened to be Judge Tanya Robinson. But her title does not change the facts. This could all have been anyone. These men wore a badge, a symbol of trust. They betrayed it. They thought no one would believe the victim. They thought the system would protect them. But the evidence tells a different story. Your duty is clear. Hold them accountable. Show that no one is above the law. He stepped back. The gallery erupted in hushed murmurs, quickly silenced by the gavel. Blake rose slowly. His voice carried strain, but he fought to project confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has shown you clips, fragments, moments taken out of context. My clients have served this community for years. They have faced danger, made sacrifices, and performed their duties with courage. Are they perfect? No. But no one island the prosecution would have you believe these men acted out of malice. I say they acted in the line of duty. The circumstances were tense. The driver was uncooperative. Mistakes may have been made, but mistakes are not crimes. You are not here to punish imperfect men. You are here to weigh evidence, and if there is doubt, and there must be doubt, you are bound by your oath to acquit. He returned to his seat, his words hanging in the air like smoke. The jury was dismissed. They filed out, solemn, their faces etched with the gravity of what they carried. The courtroom buzzed, the gallery whispering, reporters already typing their updates. Miller sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the table. Turner leaned forward, his hands trembling, his lips pressed into a thin line. Blake whispered urgently to them, but neither responded. In the gallery, people speculated in low voices. Some believed the jury would convict quickly. Others feared hesitation, the weight of uniforms, the instinct to excuse authority. Hours passed. The courthouse grew restless. Outside, chants rose louder. Inside, the tension pressed heavier. At last, the bailiff entered. The jury has reached a verdict. The jury filed back in, their faces grave. Foreperson, Linda Parker, stood when addressed. Madam Foreperson, Judge Grant said, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? Yes, Your Honor. The courtroom was silent, the air thick. In the case of the state versus Officer Scott Miller, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. Gasps and cheers erupted, quickly silenced by the gavel. In the case of the state versus Officer Kevin Turner, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. The gallery exploded, people rising to their feet, some crying, others cheering. Reporters scrambled, pens flying, cameras flashing. The gavel struck again and again until silence returned. Miller's face turned pale, his jaw slack. Turner buried his face in his hands. Blake sat motionless, his expression stunned. Judge Grant's voice was steady. Sentencing will be scheduled. Officers Miller and Turner, you are remanded into custody immediately. The bailiff stepped forward, handcuffs glinting under the lights. For the first time, Miller and Turner looked stripped of power, their arrogance gone. They were led out of the courtroom as the gallery erupted once more. Outside, the courthouse steps became a sea of sound. Protesters cheered, activists embraced, reporters shouted into cameras. The verdict had become more than a local story. It was national. Tanya Robinson, no longer the presiding judge but still the woman at the heart of the case, walked slowly down the courthouse steps later that evening. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. She stopped, her posture tall, her voice calm. This verdict is not about me, she said. It is about accountability. It is about showing that power does not place anyone above the law. What happened to me has happened to countless others who never had the chance to be heard. Today, the jury listened. Today, justice spoke. Her words rippled through the crowd, carried by reporters within minutes to millions watching. Weeks later, the headlines still echoed. Miller and Turner were sentenced, prison time, loss of badges, reputations in ruins. Investigations into their past conduct unearthed more complaints, forcing the department into reforms. For Tanya, the storm had passed, but the weight remained. In chambers, she sat quietly one evening, robe folded neatly beside her, eyes lingering on the gavel. She thought of that night, of the shattered taillight, the shove, the words meant to strip her dignity. She thought of the trial, of carrying her silence until it broke. And she thought of the verdict, of the jury that chose to see truth instead of excuse. Justice, she knew, was never simple. It was a fight. Sometimes in the streets, sometimes in the courtroom, sometimes in the silence of someone standing tall when others tried to push them down. She had been that someone. And now, her story stood as proof that no badge, no lie, no arrogance could bury the truth forever.